If you've ever heard about the Rwandan Genocide, but you don't understand what it was, and you don't understand what caused hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to murder their neighbors, armed predominantly with machetes, then this video aims to provide a very quick, very simplified explanation of the causes of the Rwandan Genocide. Between April 7th and July 15th, 1994, the same time that the world was celebrating South Africa's first democratic elections, when Nelson Mandela sought to create the Rainbow Nation and the world celebrated this, at the same time in Rwanda, between 800,000 and 1 million Rwandans were murdered by other Rwandans. This was a genocide in which the majority ethnic group, the Hutus, aimed to wipe out the minority ethnic group, the Tutsis. Their victims were not only Tutsis, but it was also Hutu moderates, or Hutus who sought to protect Tutsis during the genocide. This was a very brutal genocide. Rwanda is a small country in Central Africa, made up of 3 ethnic groups. The Hutu majority, who comprised about 85% of the population, the Tutsi minority, who comprised about 14% of the population, and the remaining 1% was comprised of the Twas. During this genocide, the Hutus aimed to eliminate the Tutsis, who they perceived as being a threat. But why was this the case? And what caused it? On the 6th of April, 1994, the airplane that was carrying the Rwandan president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down. And the next day, the genocide began. Now, to understand the genocide, it's also important to understand briefly Rwanda's colonial past. Rwanda was colonized in 1898 by Germany. When the Germans arrived in Rwanda, they encountered 2 groups: Tutsi, which meant noble, and Hutu, which meant peasant. Also a minority group of the Twa, who are believed to be the original hunter-gatherer inhabitants of the region. When the Germans arrived, and during this time Europe has an obsession with racial sciences, they promoted this idea of the Tutsi nobility, who are more similar to Europeans, and they ruled Rwanda through the Tutsi aristocracy. At the end of the First World War, when Germany was defeated and its colonies were handed over to the Allies, Rwanda was incorporated with Burundi and ruled by Belgium. When Belgium ruled Rwanda, they further solidified this distinction between Hutu and Tutsi. They measured people's heights, they measured people's noses, and they legally, on your ID book, you would be classified as Hutu or Tutsi. They made it rigid. Now, the actual origins or differences between Hutu and Tutsis is a very controversial. Some people believe that it was 2 ethnic groups. Some people believe that it was the same people, and it's just that the nobility were the Tutsi and the peasants were the Hutu, but they are the same ethnicity. But during this colonial period, what was promoted was this idea that the Hutus arrived first, the Tutsis came as conquerors, and the Tutsis conquered and ruled and exploited the Hutus. And this was promoted, this idea. But when the Germans ruled and when the Belgians ruled, they favored the Tutsi. Belgium further solidified it and made it a rigid distinction. Legally, on your book, ID book, you had to be either registered as a Hutu or a Tutsi. During the end of the Second World War, during the decolonization period, the United Nations put pressure on Belgium to grant its colonies independence. At this stage, Belgium realized that it would be in their best interest now to make a U-turn in policy and start to favor the Hutus over the Tutsis. Because if Rwanda becomes a democratic state in the modern period, and it's a democracy, and the Hutus are the majority, obviously the Hutus are going to be the new ruling class. Belgium made a complete U-turn in policy. In 1959, shortly before Rwanda gets its independence, there was what is known as the Hutu Revolution, where Hutus sought to take power back from Tutsis. The Tutsis attacked a predominant Hutu politician, and in response there was a lot of violence against Tutsis. Now, in response to this violence taking place against the Tutsis, they leave Rwanda and go into neighboring countries. Between 1959 and 1962, during the Hutu revolution, a huge refugee Tutsi population will emerge. Rwanda gets its independence in 1961, and in 1962, Burundi breaks away and becomes a separate state. And this refugee Tutsi population of Rwandans either comes south into Burundi, they go north into Uganda, they go west into what is today the DRC, or they go east into what is today Tanzania. And they live there as exiles, always wanting to return back home to Rwanda. Now, Rwanda, like all other African countries, were once colonies, and during the post-colonial period, they faced the same challenges. When conditions are good, things are okay. But when there's a drop in commodity prices, and these colonies which provide which during the colonial period produced one cash crop particularly, they are vulnerable during times of crises. So when there's a drop in like the coffee price, for example, Rwanda gets badly affected by this. And in times of economic crisis, the politicians always realize that it's always useful to bring up this ethnic hatred. For example, the first president of Rwanda, Gregory Kiyabanda, who had very narrow consolidation of his own power, when he was very unpopular, he noticed that when there was an attack by these Tutsi refugees who want to come back home, if he stirred up the anti-Tutsi hatred, he would become more popular. It would help. And this became a very useful political tool. In spite of this, Gregory Kiyabanda, who got his support predominantly from southern Hutus, was eventually overthrown in a military coup in 1973 by a northern Hutu, Juvenal Habyarimana. Gregory Kiyabanda introduced many discriminatory policies against the Tutsis. Habyarimana continued this, but he did not take it a step further. During Habyarimana's rule, and Habyarimana was a dictator, he was an authoritarian, he ruled in a very autocratic manner, but he didn't increase any anti-Tutsi hatred because he didn't need to. During the Habyarimana years from 1973 to 1970s and most of the 1980s, economic conditions were good. But at the end of the 1980s, there was a drop in coffee prices and Rwanda was badly affected. Now taxes is increasing and Rwanda is facing a lot of economic problems. And when there's economic problems, then suddenly people begin to start criticizing the corrupt and the authoritarian practices of Habyarimana. And there's a lot of pressure on him to reform. Meanwhile, in Uganda, during the late 1980s, Milton Obote's second rule in Uganda, he had increased the discrimination against the Tutsi refugee population who were in Uganda. And they sided with his opposition, Museveni. And they supported him and they played a huge role in Museveni's armed forces. And they overthrew Milton Obote. And Museveni came to power in Uganda. And this force of trained Ugandan Tutsi soldiers always wanted to return back home. And when their leader was dismissed by Museveni, he joined a group, an army, and of Tutsis, the RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front, who wanted to return back into Rwanda. And at this point in time, in 1990, where they hear that Habyarimana's regime is on the verge of crumbling, he's very unpopular because of the economic problems. This is their opportunity. And they attempt to return to Rwanda and take control of it, beginning what's known as the Rwandan Civil War. Their forces are not very successful, but they start attacking. Their leader is killed, and he gets replaced by Paul Kagame, who want to take control, want to put an end to Habyarimana's regime. Habyarimana is getting increasing pressure to reform, to end the one-party state. And he has to reform, and in Tanzania, the various forces meet up in Tanzania and they sign the Arusha Accords. Now, Habyarimana is not only facing a problem from the RPF, but he's also facing a problem from a very, very radical Hutu group. The radical group of Hutus were opposed to the reforms that Habyarimana was making with the Arusha Accords. And they were looking for an opportunity to encourage violence and hatred against the Tutsi. From 1990 until 1994, an enormous amount of money was spent on importing weapons, mainly machetes. And they were preparing. There were Thousand Hill Free Radio Station, which was encouraging and explaining why Tutsis are responsible for all the problems that Rwanda faces, vilifying the RPF. And it's also important to understand that the RPF, who were launching attacks into Rwanda, was also displacing and causing Hutu refugees. So there was a lot of tension building up. And the spark that would initiate the genocide was when the president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi, who were traveling together, the plane was shot down. Now, up to today, it's very uncertain. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about who shot down the plane. Well, Hutu extremists shot down the plane so that they could blame it on Tutsis, and this could be the excuse to initiate the genocide? Was it RPF forces that shot down the plane so that something like a genocide would take place and they would have an excuse to take control of Rwanda? We don't know, but these are a lot of conspiracy theories. What we do know is that when the plane was shot down, on the radio stations, the message was given, cut down the tall trees, and immediately a genocide ensued, where for the next 100 days, from the 7th of April until the 15th of July, thousands and thousands of Hutus turned on their neighbors, their Tutsi neighbors, and started to kill and started to exterminate. It was a very, very, very brutal genocide. So that is just a very short summary of the causes of the Rwandan genocide. I will make a much longer video where I go into more detail what happened during the genocide, also go into more detail some of the causes that I rushed through in this video. But one takeaway from this video, in spite of the genocide, Rwanda has kind of made a U-turn. In the contemporary period, Rwanda is lumped with those African countries which are part of the Africa Rising movement, where they have reversed a lot of the economic problems that characterized Africa during the 1980s. And there are a few cases of African countries who are doing well in the 21st century. One of them is Rwanda. It's another story for another day, but it has one of the lowest corruption rates, and it is seen as a success story. But there is also a lot of criticism against its leader today, Paul Kagame. Thank you.